The night my parents first stepped into my cafe, they didn't say a word. Their farm was gone, my sister's money wasted, their pride shattered. And me? I placed 2 cups of coffee in front of them, the very dream they once called foolish. That was my revenge, quiet, simple, and final. But if you want to know how I got there, you have to go back with me, to the farm, to the beginning of everything. I still remember the smell of fresh-cut hay clinging to my clothes, the sound of the screen door slamming shut as I carried breakfast trays to the fields. I was the one who kept this farm alive when the tractors broke down, when the bills piled up, when the animals needed care in the middle of the night. My parents used to say, "You're a steady rock, you never let us down." But the truth was, they didn't see me, not really. They saw my younger sister, Amy, with her long hair and easy smile, the kind of girl who could charm the whole town just by walking into the diner. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I had a dream no one else could steal from me. While they poured everything into the farm, I tucked away scraps of ideas on paper napkins, recipes written on the backs of receipts. I dreamed of a cafe, not fancy, just warm, with pie cooling in the window and a coffee pot always ready. A place where people came not to argue about debts or weather, but to sit, breathe, and feel like they belonged. But in our town, dreams like mine sounded foolish. Everyone believed in land and livestock. My father's words still ring in my ears. Farms feed families. Coffee shops don't pay bills. He'd chuckle, and my mother would nod in agreement, as though the subject were settled. So I pushed my dreams down, deeper and deeper, like seeds that might never see the sun. Every morning I rose before dawn. I fixed the accounts, paid off overdue loans by shifting money around, convinced creditors to wait another week. My sister slept late, went shopping with friends, or spent afternoons on the phone. When storms hit and the roof leaked, it was me who climbed the ladder, patching holes in the rain while Dad cursed the sky. I told myself it was worth it. One day they'd see. But sometimes, late at night, I'd stand in the empty kitchen and whisper to myself, "This isn't forever. Someday I'll have my place." I could almost hear the sound of a bell above the door, the hum of conversation, the sweet comfort of coffee filling the air. That dream kept me going. That dream and the quiet belief that hard work would be enough. I didn't yet know that the very people I worked hardest for would be the ones to break me. Because the day would come when I'd walk into the notary's office, and everything I thought I'd earned would vanish with a single signature. The morning it happened, the sky was too bright for what I was about to face. I remember standing in front of the mirror, hands calloused, hair pulled back, wearing the same faded shirt I'd worn 100 times in the fields. I looked like the farm itself, worn down but still standing. Amy, on the other hand, waltzed past in a new dress, lipstick shining, not a speck of dirt under her nails. She looked like she'd never touched a shovel in her life. "You ready?" she asked, twirling the car keys. I didn't answer. My stomach twisted. I didn't know why. The notary's office smelled of paper and dust, the air heavy with silence. My parents sat stiffly, their eyes avoiding mine. I thought maybe they were nervous about debts, about keeping the farm afloat another year. I never imagined the truth. The papers were already on the desk when we walked in. The notary adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said words that knocked the air from my chest. "This deed transfers full ownership of the farm to Amy Reynolds." I stared at the page, the letters swimming. Surely there was a mistake. Surely my name was somewhere. But there it was, black ink, clear as day. Everything I had built, every night I stayed up balancing books, every morning I carried the farm on my back, all of it belonged to her now. My father didn't meet my eyes. My mother's hands trembled, but she said nothing. And Amy, she smiled. Not cruel, not smug, just careless, like it meant nothing to her. That hurt most of all. I wanted to scream, to ask how they could do this to me. But no words came. Only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. So I stood, tucked my chair back, and said, "Thank you." My voice was calm, steady. They didn't know that inside me, something had cracked wide open. I walked out of that office, and the sunlight felt different. Sharper. The air was cold against my skin. I realized then that I was free from the farm, free from their chains, free from waiting for them to notice me. What they didn't know, what none of them could even imagine, was that I was about to build something stronger than their farm, something they would one day crawl back to. And when they did, I'd be the one pouring the coffee. I didn't go back home after the notary's office. The gravel road that led to the farmhouse looked the same as always, but to me it was a dead end. Instead, I drove past it, straight into town. My hands were shaking on the wheel, but I felt lighter than I had in years. Downtown wasn't much, 2 blocks of brick buildings, a diner, a drugstore, and an old building with boarded-up windows. I parked in front of it and just sat there, staring. The sign was gone, but I remembered it used to be a bakery. For years it stood empty, collecting dust, while people whispered that nothing good ever lasted in this town. But I didn't see an empty shell. I saw sunlight spilling through those dirty windows, the smell of cinnamon rolls, the steady hiss of coffee brewing. My cafe, not theirs, not the farm's, mine. Of course, I didn't have money. Not enough for rent, not enough for an espresso machine, not even enough for paint. But I had time, I had hands, and I had a heart that wouldn't quit. And for the first time in my life, no one could stop me. That night, I found a job washing dishes at the diner. The pay was small, the hours brutal. But I didn't care. Each dollar I folded into an envelope marked dream. It sat under my pillow like a secret no one could steal. And sometimes, when the diner closed, I'd stay behind, testing recipes on scraps of dough, scribbling ideas in the margins of receipts. Customers never saw me, but I was there, shaping my future out of flour and stubborn hope. What I didn't know is that the town had already started watching me. And in a place like ours, every dream looks like a threat to somebody. The weeks blurred into months. I woke at dawn, worked at the diner, then slipped over to the old bakery building to peek through the dusty glass. I'd press my hand against the cold window and whisper someday. But word travels fast in a small town. Folks started asking why I wasn't back on the farm, why I wasn't helping Amy. I smiled politely, but inside, their questions cut deep. One night, after closing, I overheard 2 women at the counter whispering. "She walked away from all that land," one said. "Foolish. No one survives here without roots." I scrubbed the same plate for too long, hands trembling, but I stayed quiet. Let them talk. They didn't know I was building something stronger than roots, something that would stand even when the soil gave way. By spring, my envelope had grown fat. I ran my fingers over the bills, counting them by lamplight. Still not enough, but close. Close enough to believe. That's when Amy showed up at the diner. She slid into a booth, painted nails tapping against the formica, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Still scrubbing dishes?" she asked. I nodded, refusing to bite. "Well, keep at it. Somebody's gotta do the dirty work." She left without ordering, her perfume lingering in the air like poison. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't just careless. She was watching me, waiting. That night, I walked past the old bakery again. The street was empty, the lamppost flickering, but something made me stop. In the window, behind the grime and broken glass, I thought I saw a light faint, golden, like the glow of an oven. I blinked and it was gone. I pressed my hand against the glass, heart pounding. The building was locked, abandoned, no electricity running through it for years. And yet, for one impossible second, I smelled coffee. Rich, dark, and warm. I stepped back, shaken. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was losing my mind. But in that moment, I felt it. The building was calling me. As if it had been waiting, all this time, for someone to breathe life back into it. What I didn't know was that my sister wasn't the only one keeping an eye on me. The town had its own ghosts, and when you stir old dreams, you wake old grudges. And as I walked away, I felt the first stirrings of something darker than envy, heavier than betrayal. Something was coming. I just didn't know if it would destroy me or everyone else. The lease agreement felt heavier than any burden I had carried on the farm. The paper was thin, almost translucent, but the words written on it carried the weight of my entire future. The landlord, a man who had grown old waiting for this little town to revive, eyed me with a mixture of pity and disbelief. He had seen dreams come and go through those boarded-up windows, none of them lasting longer than a season. His voice was rough as gravel when he finally slid the paper toward me. 6 months, he muttered, his pen scratching across the bottom. That's all I can give you. If you can make it, good for you. If not, he shrugged. The building will still be here, like it always is. I nodded, though my throat was tight. 6 months. That was all the time I had to turn a hollow shell of a bakery into the cafe I had been building in my mind since I was a child. 6 months to prove to my family, to this town, and maybe even to myself that I was more than the girl who carried the farm on her back. The first time I stepped into the place as its tenant, not just a passerby staring through dirty glass, I nearly wept. The smell was thick with dust and mildew. The walls bore water stains from years of leaks, streaking down like old tears. The floor creaked with every step, boards warped and soft, threatening to give way beneath me. A faded calendar still hung crooked on the wall, the year frozen in 1979. It felt less like a building and more like a tomb. But I didn't see rot and decay. I saw sunlight breaking through grime-streaked windows. I saw pies lined up on the sill, steam curling through the air. I saw neighbors lingering at chipped wooden tables, cups of coffee warming their hands, conversations soft and unhurried. The vision was so clear I could almost hear the bell above the door. For the first time since walking out of that notary's office, I felt something like hope. I rolled up my sleeves and set to work. The first day was nothing but sweeping years of dust, filling black garbage bags until my arms ached. The second day, I scrubbed the counters with vinegar and soap until the wood grain showed again. By the third day, I had blisters blooming across my palms and my back screamed from bending, but I kept going. Each task was a prayer, each stroke of the brush or rag a promise to myself. This place would live again. Of course, I wasn't alone, not really. In a town like ours, nothing stays hidden. By the end of that first week, whispers started to drift back to me. At the diner, where I still worked nights to save every dollar, I heard my name hissed like a warning. She's wasting her time. She could have stayed on the farm, but she had to run off and play city girl. Coffee doesn't pay bills, not here. I tried to shut it out. Let them talk. Gossip had always been the language of this place, but I had survived worse. Or so I thought. Because gossip doesn't just float harmlessly in the air, it sticks, it spreads, and soon it changes shape. It was Amy who twisted the knife. She never wasted a chance to remind people that I had walked away. One evening, I overheard a pair of women whispering at the counter as I wiped down tables. One said, "Her sister told me she stole money from the farm before she left. That's how she's paying for that cafe." The other gasped. "Really? I thought she was taking loans from shady folks. That's why she's always working nights." I froze, rag in hand, my heart thudding. Stole money? Loan sharks? It was absurd. Every penny I had was earned with sweat, scrubbing dishes until my hands cracked, staying up long after midnight baking experiments with borrowed flour. But Amy's lies slid easily into their ears because people wanted to believe them. It was easier to think I had cheated than to admit I might succeed. That night, lying awake in my small rented room above the hardware store, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every word. My sister wasn't just ignoring me anymore. She was poisoning me, drop by drop, in the eyes of the town. And my parents? They stayed silent, which meant consent. Still, I pressed on. Every nail I hammered, every wall I scrubbed felt like a declaration. I will not break. I will not crawl back. The town could whisper, Amy could lie, my parents could pretend I didn't exist, but this cafe would rise, if only through sheer stubbornness. Yet, as I stood in the half-light of the bakery one evening, sweat dripping from my brow, I felt the weight of eyes on me. The town wasn't just talking anymore. It was watching. Suppliers were the next to turn. It started small. The mill owner avoided my calls, claiming he was short on flour, though I knew his silos were full. Then the dairy truck stopped coming by my street altogether. When I finally cornered the driver outside the diner, he rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Your daddy asked us not to sell to you. Said there's bad blood. I don't want trouble." His words hit harder than any fist. I walked away carrying nothing but shame and a hollow ache in my chest. My own father was building walls to keep me out. He wasn't content to let me go, he wanted me to fail. But I was resourceful. I always had been. I found scraps where others saw waste. Old Mrs. Parker from the church slipped me a bag of flour one Sunday, whispering, "Don't tell anyone I gave you this. But I remember what you did for your mama when she was sick. You've earned it." A traveling salesman left me half a crate of sugar, muttering something about liking your spirit. I even convinced the diner cook to let me take home leftover dough, which I turned into small rolls, hard and uneven, but mine. Every night, after finishing my shift, I carried those scraps to the bakery. I worked under the glow of a single bulb, patching holes, sketching menus, sanding old tables I had scavenged from the town dump. My hands blistered, my back screamed, but I felt alive in a way I never had on the farm. This place wasn't a burden strapped to my shoulders, it was mine, born from nothing but grit and stubborn will. Still, I felt the town pressing against me. When I walked down Main Street, conversations hushed. When I stepped into the hardware store, people looked away. Even the pastor, who once praised my dedication on the farm, shook his head and muttered about pride leading to downfall. They didn't want me to succeed. Success would make me a mirror, forcing them to see their own smallness, their own chains. But I kept going. The first night, I lit a candle inside the bakery and smelled bread rising. I nearly cried. The aroma filled the air, clinging to my clothes, carrying me back to childhood dreams. For a moment, the place felt alive again. And then, one night, the dream cracked. It was close to midnight. My arms were weak from scrubbing, my hair stuck to my neck with sweat. I finally gathered my tools, blew out the candle, and stepped into the quiet street. The town was silent, the air thick with summer heat. Then, the sharp, unmistakable crash of breaking glass. I spun around, heart racing. The front window of my bakery, the one I had polished until it gleamed, now bore a jagged wound. Shards glittered on the pavement like fallen stars. My breath caught in my throat. I rushed back, boots crunching on broken glass. Nothing was missing. There was nothing of value yet, only half-fixed walls and mismatched chairs. But in the middle of the floor lay a brick wrapped in paper. With trembling hands, I unwrapped it. Black letters sprawled across the page, crude and furious. "Go back to the farm before we bury you in it." The words bled into me like poison. My fingers shook, the paper cutting into my skin. I looked around, the street stretched empty in both directions, no footsteps, no shadows. Whoever had done it was already gone, swallowed by the night. But I knew this wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. As I stood there, the broken glass reflecting the dim glow of the streetlight, I realized the truth. This town wasn't just doubting me anymore. It wanted me destroyed. And the people who should have stood beside me, my own blood, were the ones who lit the match. The battle for my cafe had begun, and I had no idea how many pieces of myself I'd lose before it was over. The morning after the brick crashed through my bakery window, I stood on Main Street with a broom in my hand and the taste of metal in my mouth. The sun was already climbing, gold spilling across the red bricks of the storefronts, but the light felt cruel. It revealed every shard scattered across the pavement, every jagged reminder that someone in this town wanted me gone. I swept slowly, carefully, the crunch of glass loud in the silence. People walked past, but no one stopped. A man tipped his hat stiffly, a woman pulled her child closer, and an old neighbor I'd once helped during harvest season crossed to the other side of the street. Not a single voice asked if I was all right. That silence cut deeper than the brick. It told me what I already knew. The town had chosen sides. By mid-morning, I was hammering plywood over the hole. Each strike echoed down the empty street, bouncing between the boarded-up movie theater and the rusting hardware store. The sound was harsh, but it steadied me. The hammer in my hand felt like defiance. If they wanted me silent, I would be loud. If they wanted me weak, I would stand. At the diner that evening, where I worked every night to keep the dream alive, the air grew thick when I walked in. Conversations dimmed, then swelled again in whispers as I tied my apron. "She's fixing holes already. The Lord sends warnings and she don't listen." Maybe she should have stayed with her family where she belonged. Their words wrapped around me like chains. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile as I poured coffee, cleared plates, and kept my voice steady. But every whisper, every sidelong glance, scraped against my ribs. When my shift ended, I crossed the quiet street to the bakery. The boards nailed across the window looked like a scar. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of dust and paint, but I didn't stop. I scrubbed the floor on my knees until my hands burned, then patched holes with plaster until my arms ached. My body begged for rest, but I refused. Work was my only answer, my only weapon. Around midnight, I sat down on a rickety chair I had rescued from a junk pile. The room was bare, the walls raw, the windows blind. For a moment, I let my head fall into my hands. Exhaustion pressed against me, heavier than the farm work ever had. At least back then, I had been acknowledged. Here, I was invisible or worse, despised. Could one woman fight an entire town? Could I stand against the whispers, the sabotage, the cold stares, with nothing but an empty room and a pocket of dreams? But then the strangest thing happened. As I sat there in the dark, the scent of cinnamon brushed past me. It wasn't real. There was no oven, no sugar, nothing baking in that hollow space. But the smell was sharp and warm, curling through my imagination like a promise. I closed my eyes and I saw it again. Pies lined in the window, coffee cups steaming in friendly hands, children laughing with sticky fingers, neighbors leaning close to share their secrets over warm bread. For a moment, the vision was so vivid it felt like the walls themselves were breathing. I opened my eyes and the smell was gone, replaced by the harsh sting of bleach. But my chest felt stronger. I gripped the edge of the chair and whispered into the empty room, "I'll make them see. I'll make them understand. Even if it kills me." The room didn't answer. The town outside stayed silent. But deep down, I knew the battle had only just begun. The days after the brick and the boarded window slid into a grueling rhythm that pressed me down like a weight across my shoulders. I woke before sunrise, dragged myself into the diner, poured coffee for people who never tipped, wiped down counters sticky with sugar, smiled through the burn in my throat when customers asked slyly, "So, how's that fancy cafe coming along?" They didn't want an answer. They wanted to see me stumble, to hear me admit defeat, to know that their whispers were true. When my shift ended, I walked across Main Street into the bakery, carrying scraps of food or a few coins slipped into my apron pocket. The moment I opened the door, the smell of bleach and dust rushed over me, heavy and sharp. My body ached, but I forced myself to scrub, to hammer, to paint. Every task felt endless, like digging a tunnel through stone with my bare hands, but at the end of each night I could see it. One wall brighter, one corner cleaner, one chair restored. Little victories that kept me moving forward. The envelope-marked dream grew thicker, though never quite enough. I handled it constantly, counting and recounting, imagining the day I would trade the worn bills for an oven, a coffee pot, maybe even a secondhand sign above the door. I hid it beneath my mattress, because trust had become a rare currency in this town. And still the whispers followed me. At the market, women clutched their baskets and shook their heads. At church, I caught men exchanging glances when I walked past, their mouths tightening into thin lines. At the diner, I overheard Amy's voice floating in from the corner booth where she held court with her friends. "She thinks she's better than us now," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "But she doesn't even know how to run a real business. Daddy says she'll lose everything before summer's out." Her laughter, joined by the others, scraped against me like broken glass. I wanted to turn, to shout, to tell them I had given everything to the farm, that I had poured my life into their fields while Amy danced through hers untouched. But I said nothing. My silence was heavier than their cruelty, a silence I carried across the street, into the bakery, where I whispered my defiance into the walls instead. One night, bone-tired from double shifts, I found myself on my knees scrubbing the floor again. The boards were rough, stained with years of neglect, and the bucket water turned black within minutes. My arms shook, my back screamed, and tears stung my eyes, not from pain but from the suffocating sense of futility. What was I doing? Why was I pouring myself into this hollow place when the whole town was set on breaking me? I dropped the rag, sat back against the wall, and closed my eyes. For a moment, the exhaustion swallowed me whole. And then it happened again. The faint, sweet scent of cinnamon brushed through the air. I inhaled sharply, my eyes snapping open, but there was nothing. Just bleach, dust, and the rag lying limp beside me. Still, the memory of that warmth, that comfort, wrapped around me like a hand on my shoulder. I whispered into the empty space, "You can laugh. You can lie. You can break every window. But I'm not leaving." The words echoed softly against the walls, and for the first time in weeks, I believed them. It was after 1 a.m. when I finally locked the bakery and stepped into the still night. The streets were empty, the lamplight flickering against cracked sidewalks. My envelope of tips pressed against my chest, a fragile shield of hope. That's when I saw it. A burlap sack slumped on the doorstep, damp and reeking. I crouched down, thinking maybe foolishly that it was a delivery, a kindness from someone who believed in me. But when I touched the fabric, the stench hit me. Sour milk, rotting eggs, vegetables gone slimy with decay. Flies buzzed around the seams. On top of the pile lay a folded paper, dark stains smeared across its surface. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. The letters were carved into the page with such force they nearly tore through. "This is all you'll ever serve." I froze. The sack sat heavy on the wood, dripping foul liquid, seeping into the floorboards I had spent weeks restoring. My stomach lurched, while burning my throat. I glanced down the street empty. But I felt them. Eyes in the dark. Someone was out there, watching, waiting to see me recoil, to see me break. I clutched my envelope tighter, the paper damp against my palm. Rage and fear twisted together inside me until I couldn't tell one from the other. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a message. They weren't going to let me build my dream quietly. They were going to fight me every step of the way. And as I stood there in the stink of rot and betrayal, I understood. I wasn't simply chasing a dream anymore. I was at war. The first morning I propped the bakery door open to welcome the town. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of dew from the fields. Sunlight spilled across the front windows, catching the streaks I had polished with aching arms until my hands were raw. For the first time, the place looked less like a ruin and more like a beginning. Inside, mismatched chairs stood around uneven tables, their scratches softened by the care I had given them. The walls, still smelling faintly of fresh paint, glowed pale against the morning light. I had brewed coffee in a dented second-hand pot and set out rolls baked from scraps of flour and sugar I had begged and bartered for. The aroma of roasted beans filled the room, clinging to the curtains, weaving itself into the air like a promise. I stood behind the counter with my hands clasped, heart hammering against my ribs. The bell above the door was silent. Every second stretched until it felt like hours. I told myself not to expect anyone on the first day, but hope is a stubborn thing. It rises even when it has no reason to. Finally, the bell rang. An old man with a cane shuffled in, his boots dragging against the wood. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the patched walls and uneven floor, and asked if I had apple pie. I didn't, not yet, but I poured him coffee, set a roll on a chipped plate, and placed it gently before him. He drank in silence, staring at the window. When he finished, he nodded once, left a coin on the table, and walked out without a word. My heart leapt at the sound of that coin hitting the wood. It was more than payment, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't invisible, that someone had stepped into my dream and sat down. Later, 2 schoolgirls came giggling through the door, their braids bouncing as they looked around with wide eyes. They ordered hot chocolate, whispering behind their hands as I stirred the milk and cocoa. They sat for a few minutes, barely touching their cups, then hurried out, the bell jingling behind them. Through the glass, I saw them stop on the sidewalk where Amy was waiting. She bent close, whispering something that made them burst into laughter before they skipped away. The next day, a woman came in and bought a loaf of bread. She left with a smile, but when I saw her at the market later that week, she avoided my eyes. I overheard her telling another woman, "The place smells strange." I wouldn't trust her kitchen. By the second week, the pattern had settled into something I couldn't ignore. A man would sit for coffee, then never return. A family would buy pastries, then tell others they were stale. Lies whispered across fences, exchanged in pews, passed along like gossip was a form of currency. Her prices are too high. She cuts corners. She's trying too hard, and it shows. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Whispers always outran facts in a place like ours. Every morning, I rearranged the tables, polished the counters, and baked until my arms ached. I told myself that persistence would wear down resistance, that kindness would win over cruelty. But the empty chairs and silent afternoons carved out into me, sharp and unrelenting. And still, I refused to close the door. This cafe was mine. Every splinter pulled from my hands, every night spent scrubbing floors, every coin folded into my envelope had been poured into it. I would not let them steal this from me, too. But deep down, in the quiet moments between footsteps, I felt it, the town pressing against me, a slow suffocation. And I knew the battle had only just begun. By the third week, the cafe had become a stage for humiliation. I opened each morning with hope stitched into my chest, only to watch it unravel thread by thread as hours passed. Sometimes a stranger wandered in, a trucker looking for coffee, a traveler passing through, but locals rarely lingered. They came in once, tested me, then vanished back into the town's shadows. The whispers grew sharper. I heard them even when I tried not to listen. At the market, she doesn't know what she's doing. That cafe won't last a season. At church, she turned her back on her parents. God doesn't bless ungrateful children. Each word dug into me like nails, but I forced myself to stand tall, to keep my chin lifted when I poured coffee or wiped tables. If they wanted to see me broken, they would have to wait longer. But Amy didn't want to wait. It was a Friday afternoon when she arrived with her entourage, 4 girls dressed in bright colors, their laughter filling the cafe before the door even swung shut. Amy led them inside like she owned the place. Her heels clicked against the floorboards, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. She sat at a table near the window, her friends fanning out around her, their eyes sweeping the room with practiced disdain. I approached with my notepad, my smile tight but steady. "What can I get for you?" Amy leaned back in her chair, eyes glittering. "Oh, we're just here to see how you're doing. Daddy says you've been struggling." Her friends giggled, covering their mouths with painted nails. My face flushed hot, but I didn't let my voice shake. "Coffee? Pastries?" She smirked. "Bring us what you've got. Surprise us." I served them rolls and coffee, my hands steady even as my heart thundered. They nibbled at the edges, made faces, whispered too loudly. One girl spat her bite into a napkin, declaring, "Too dry." Another stirred sugar endlessly into her cup, then pushed it away untouched. Amy tapped her spoon against the table, her voice rising so the whole cafe, what little of it there was, could hear. "It's cute, really. But it's nothing compared to the farm. You remember the farm, right? Where you used to work for all of us. Maybe you should have stayed there. You were better at milking cows than baking bread." Her laughter rang out, joined by her friends. Customers glanced over, uneasy, but said nothing. No one defended me. No one ever did. I stood frozen behind the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. I wanted to shout, to hurl her words back at her, but I didn't. I swallowed the bitterness and let it sink deep into me, where it hardened into something stronger. Silence had always been my armor, and I wore it again that day. When they finally left, leaving crumbs and laughter behind, I cleaned the table slowly, each swipe of the cloth a vow. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me crumble. But the night had other plans. The cafe was quiet after dark, the streets outside empty under a low-hanging moon. I stayed late, wiping down counters, rearranging chairs, telling myself that tomorrow would be better, that persistence would wear them down. At last, I blew out the candles and locked the door. As I walked away, the faint glow of fire caught my eye. I spun around, horror clutching my chest. Smoke curled from the back window, thin at first, then thickening fast. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed back, fumbling with the keys, throwing the door open. Heat slapped me in the face. Flames licked the edge of a curtain, hungry and wild. I grabbed a bucket, filled it from the sink, and doused the fire until steam hissed into the air. Again and again, I threw water until the last ember died. The cafe was safe, barely. The curtain was gone, a blackened scar on the wall, the air heavy with smoke. My lungs burned as I dropped to the floor, gasping. That's when I saw it, something glinting near the back door, half hidden in the ash. I picked it up with shaking hands. A charm bracelet. Delicate, gold, the kind Amy always wore. The sight of it made my blood run cold. She hadn't just come to humiliate me in daylight. She had come back in the night, leaving fire in her wake. And as I clutched the bracelet in the smoke-filled dark, I realized this wasn't rivalry anymore. It was war, and my own sister had lit the first flame. The smoke from the fire clung to my walls for days. No matter how many windows I opened or how much vinegar I boiled on the stove, the scent lingered, acrid, bitter, a ghost that refused to leave. Each morning, when I pushed open the cafe door, the smell wrapped around me, whispering reminders of how close I had come to losing everything. But the bracelet in my drawer reminded me of something else. Who had set that fire? Amy's laughter still echoed in my ears from the day she came with her friends, her words sharp as knives. I had no proof anyone else had been near the cafe that night. Only her bracelet, glinting in the ash. It wasn't evidence enough to take to the sheriff, not that he would have listened to me over my father's daughter, but it was proof enough for my heart. I considered confronting her, marching up to the farmhouse and slamming the bracelet down on the table between us. But I knew how that would end. She'd twist it into another lie, another story to turn the town against me. No, silence had always been my shield, and now it became my weapon. I would not give her the satisfaction of knowing she had shaken me. Instead, I scrubbed the walls, patched the damage, and worked harder than ever. I slept little, rising before dawn to knead dough, staying up past midnight to sand chairs and mend curtains. My hands cracked and bled, but I pressed on, driven by something deeper than pride. This cafe wasn't just my dream anymore. It was my battleground. And slowly, cracks appeared in the town's armor. Mrs. Parker, the same woman who had once slipped me flour in secret, began coming by in the mornings. She ordered coffee, always leaving $1 more than the price, her eyes kind though her words were few. A young mechanic from the edge of town stopped in one afternoon, grease still on his hands, and asked if I had pie. I didn't, but I gave him coffee and a roll. He grinned, promising to come back. They weren't many, but they were something, small flames of loyalty in a sea of coldness. And each time the bell above the door rang, each time someone chose to sit in my cafe despite the whispers outside, I felt stronger. One evening, as I wiped down the counter, I noticed an old ledger tucked behind a shelf left by the bakery's former owner. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed, filled with recipes scrawled in faded ink. Cinnamon rolls, blackberry pie, pecan tarts. I traced the words with my fingers, imagining the smell of sugar and spice filling the air, the windows fogging with warmth. It felt like the past reaching out to guide me, reminding me that dreams had lived here before and maybe could live again. I closed the book and whispered, "You didn't survive, but I will." The town might have been tightening its noose, but I had found something they couldn't touch: resolve. And with it, the courage to believe that one day, this place would be more than a room with tables. It would be a home, not just for me but for anyone willing to step inside. The weeks after the fire bled into one another, each day stitched together by work, exhaustion, and the faint, stubborn pulse of hope. The smoke stains on the back wall faded under fresh coats of paint, the charred curtains replaced by fabric I bought secondhand from a woman clearing out her attic. The cafe was scarred, yes, but it stood. And so did I. The sheriff never came to ask about the fire. Not once. I saw him outside the diner one morning, tipping his hat to Amy as she laughed with her friends, and I knew why. My family's name carried more weight than mine ever would. The bracelet sat hidden in a drawer, its gold dulled by ash, burning in my memory like an unanswered question. But I refused to hand them the victory of despair. Instead, I worked. Each morning, I lit the lamps early, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the town, and laid out what little I could afford to bake. Some days only one customer came, sometimes none at all, but I greeted each with a smile as if the cafe were full. And then something shifted. The mechanic returned, this time with a friend. Mrs. Parker brought her knitting, staying for hours instead of minutes. A pair of farmhands wandered in one rainy afternoon and left with full bellies, promising to come back when their pay allowed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cafe began to gather a pulse. It wasn't a roar, but a heartbeat, faint, steady, alive. Of course, the whispers didn't stop. At church, I heard a woman mutter that I was corrupting the town's youth with my foolish example. At the market, a man sneered that I was spitting on my family's legacy. Each word cut deep, but I noticed something else. Fewer people laughed. Some stayed quiet. Some even looked away. The cracks were widening. One evening, after closing, I sat with the ledger I had found. My fingers traced the faded recipes, the handwriting of someone who had once tried to build what I was building now. I baked a batch of cinnamon rolls by lamplight, the smell filling the cafe until I thought it might burst from the walls. When I tasted one, warm and sweet, I felt tears sting my eyes. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was creating. That night, I walked home under the stars, tired but lighter. I told myself that no matter what they threw at me, no matter how much they tried to bury me in whispers and rot, I would rise. I had proof now in every crumb, every smile, every hesitant customer who chose to return. But I should have known the town wasn't finished with me. As I reached the cafe door, I saw a figure frozen in the lamplight. They dropped something with a metallic clang and vanished into the night. My chest tightened as I bent to pick it up, a hammer, its handle scorched with 2 words burned deep into the wood, "Not yours." My hands shook as I held it. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were warning me. The fight had only begun. The hammer sat on my counter for days, a dark reminder of the figure in the doorway. Every time I glanced at it, my stomach tightened. The message scorched into the handle, "Not yours," haunted me more than the fire, more than the brick. Bricks could be swept away, smoke could be scrubbed out. But words burned into wood, that was meant to last. Still, I refused to let them see me bend. The next morning, I opened the cafe as usual. I brewed coffee until the scent filled the street, baked cinnamon rolls until the sugar clung to the air. I placed the hammer in a drawer, hidden but not forgotten, and told myself I would not give them the victory of fear. Yet fear lingered anyway, hiding in the quiet moments. Every creak of the floorboards after dark made my heart lurch. Every shadow stretching long across the street felt like a pair of watching eyes. When customers came, I smiled and served them, but I watched their hands, their movements, wondering if one of them had stood in the lamplight that night. The whispers didn't stop. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 men arguing about my cafe. One said, "She's stubborn. Might actually make it work." The other shook his head. "Not with her father against her. That family won't let her shame them." The words twisted like a knife. My own parents, my blood, were part of this silent war against me. Suppliers kept their distance. More than once, I walked into the mill only to be told they were out of flour. I saw the bags stacked high behind the counter. At the dairy, the driver wouldn't even meet my eyes anymore. My father's shadow stretched longer than I had imagined. But then, cracks appeared. The mechanic who had become a regular started bringing others. A pair of teachers stopped in after school and returned the next week with their colleagues. Mrs. Parker, with her quiet loyalty, began to knit by the window daily, her presence a silent declaration that not everyone in town wanted me gone. Their support didn't erase the threats, but it reminded me why I was fighting. Every customer who sat in my cafe, no matter how small the order, was a victory over the whispers. Every coin that hit the counter was proof that I was not invisible. At night, though, the weight of it all pressed harder. I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the shutters, waiting for the next strike. The brick. The fire. The hammer. What would come next? I didn't know. But I knew they wouldn't stop. And neither would I. The war between me and my family no longer hid behind whispers. It showed itself in the everyday rhythm of the town. At the diner, I overheard men mutter that my father had warned everyone not to support rebellion under his roof. At church, the pastor's sermon lingered on the dangers of pride and ungrateful children, his eyes grazing mine more than once. Even the grocer, who used to slip me day-old bread, now turned me away with a stiff smile. It was clear my parents were pulling strings, weaving their influence through every corner of the town. They were determined to make sure no one forgot their version of the story, that I had abandoned them, that I was betraying the very soil that fed us. But truth has a strange way of leaking out. My sister's farm was faltering. I heard it first from a boy who sometimes cleaned the stalls at their place. He told me quietly, eyes darting toward the road, that the crops had failed in patches and some of the cattle had fallen ill. At first, I didn't believe him. My parents had always portrayed the farm as untouchable, a fortress of stability. But when I walked past the property one evening, I saw it for myself. Fields thinner than they should have been, fences leaning, silence where the sound of work usually echoed. Still, they tried to mask it. Amy drove into town with new clothes, laughing louder than ever. My father held himself taller, his voice booming at the general store as if nothing had changed. But their eyes betrayed them, sharp, restless, as if waiting for something to crumble. Meanwhile, my cafe drew life in quiet ways. The teachers returned each week. The mechanic told me my cinnamon rolls were the best thing in this town since gas under $1. Mrs. Parker's knitting by the window became almost a symbol, proof that loyalty could survive even here. My tables weren't full, not yet, but they were no longer empty either. Still, the opposition pressed harder. One evening, a supplier I'd managed to convince finally agreed to deliver flour. The next day, he came back pale and stammering, saying he couldn't do it anymore. When I asked why, he only muttered, "Some debts aren't worth the cost." Behind his words, I heard the echo of my father's voice. The strain grew unbearable. Each night, I locked the cafe with trembling hands, half expecting to find another brick, another fire, another message carved into wood. And when I closed my eyes, I saw the hammer's burned words flashing in the dark, "Not yours." But I wasn't walking away. Not again. That Sunday, I slipped quietly into the back pew of the church. The sermon was about sin, about disobedience, about children who turned from the path of duty. The pastor's voice rose, and then I heard my parents' voices join the prayer, asking God to let me see the error of my ways. My chest tightened. My own blood was praying for my downfall. And in that echoing silence, I realized they weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking for my ruin. The morning after that sermon, I opened the cafe with trembling hands. My parents' voices still rang in my ears, their prayers not for my safety but for my downfall. Yet the smell of cinnamon rolls and the warmth of brewing coffee steadied me. Work was my answer, my shield, and I clung to it as if it were the only truth left. That day, the cafe was fuller than ever. Mrs. Parker knitted by the window. The mechanic argued with a friend over the newspaper. Two teachers marked essays in the corner. For once, the air was alive with laughter. For once, I believed the tide was turning. Then Amy walked in. She moved with purpose, heels clicking against the wood, her eyes sharp. The room fell quiet. She sat, folded her hands neatly, and said, "I want to buy it." The words froze me. Buy what? The cafe. Her voice was smooth, confident. It doesn't belong to you. Daddy and Mama agree. I'll take it off your hands before it buries you. I clenched my apron, heart hammering. It's not for sale. Her smile sharpened. Everything's for sale. You'll regret saying no. Then she left, her words hanging in the air like smoke. The very next morning, the town newspaper announced, coming soon, Amy's farmhouse kitchen. A drawing showed her behind a counter, serving pies. It was a declaration of war. But I fought back the only way I knew how. I placed my own small ad, Main Street Cafe, fresh coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls. Open early. Open late. Always open for you. To my surprise, it worked. Strangers appeared, travelers, farm hands, even a young couple from the next town. For the first time, I had a line at the counter. The bell above the door sang all day long. Meanwhile, I heard whispers that the farm was failing. Blight in the fields. Cattle sold quietly. My father's booming voice had grown thin. Amy laughed louder than ever, but her eyes betrayed her. And then, one rainy night, as I locked the cafe, I saw them. Across the street stood my parents and Amy, their clothes soaked, their faces pale. They didn't call my name. They didn't move. They just stared at the light spilling from my cafe, as if it was the last fire left in their world. My chest tightened. They hadn't come to mock me, not this time. They had come because the farm was crumbling. And for the first time, they needed me. Rain slicked the streets the night my parents and Amy appeared outside the cafe. They didn't step inside, didn't call my name. They just stood in the shadows, their clothes damp, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the glow spilling from my windows. For years I had been the invisible daughter, the one whose labor was expected but never praised. Now they looked at me as if I held something they had lost. I locked the door and walked past them without a word. The next morning, the whispers confirmed what I had already guessed. The farm was unraveling. The blight had spread farther, the harvest nearly ruined. Cattle were being sold at a loss. My father's shoulders sagged, my mother's face turned haggard. And Amy, once the golden child, was burning through what little remained, pouring money into her farmhouse kitchen that never opened, not even once. Meanwhile, my cafe grew busier by the week. Teachers brought students after school. Farmhands came in before dawn, eager for hot coffee before the fields. Strangers from nearby towns followed the small ad I had placed, curious about the little cafe that refused to die. Every day, the bell above the door sang, and each ring felt like a hymn of defiance. But the town didn't cheer. Many still watched me with cold eyes, waiting for me to stumble. Yet they couldn't ignore what they saw. My cafe was thriving while the farm, the pride of my family, the backbone of this town, was collapsing. One afternoon, as I poured coffee for Mrs. Parker, Amy stormed through the door. Her hair was wild, her perfume sharp, her voice pitched with desperation. "This is mine," she hissed, her hand slamming against the counter. "You stole it from me. From all of us." I stared at her, steady and calm. "I stole nothing. I built this with my own hands." Her eyes filled with rage, but also with something I had never seen before: fear. She spun on her heel and left, her footsteps echoing like thunder. The cafe fell silent, every customer watching me, waiting for my reaction. I simply picked up the coffee pot and kept pouring. Word spread quickly after that. The farm was finished. Debts piled high, equipment sold off piece by piece. My parents disappeared from Sunday service. Amy's friends stopped visiting. The family that once cast me aside was now unraveling, and the town whispered a new story, that I, the forgotten daughter, had outlasted them all. But victory was a bitter taste, because I knew they weren't done with me yet. One night, as I counted the day's earnings by lamplight, a shadow fell across the cafe window. I looked up, heart quickening, and saw them, my parents and Amy, standing on the porch. This time, they didn't look proud or angry. They looked hollow, broken, desperate. My father's lips moved, though no sound reached me. My mother's eyes glistened with tears. And Amy, once untouchable, looked straight at me, her face pale, her voice trembling. "We have nowhere else to go." They stood on my porch like shadows torn from another life. My parents, once so proud, so immovable, now bent under the weight of failure. My sister, the chosen one, the golden child, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling. "We have nowhere else to go." For a long moment, I said nothing. The cafe behind me was warm, filled with the faint scent of cinnamon and coffee, the hum of the lamps, the comfort I had built with my own hands. Outside, they shivered, soaked with rain, faces pale as ghosts. I opened the door. Slowly, silently, they stepped inside. My father glanced around at the walls I had painted, the chairs I had sanded, the counters I had polished until they gleamed. My mother touched the back of a chair as though it might vanish. Amy stood stiffly by the window, her eyes darting, her shoulders trembling under the weight of silence. I moved behind the counter, poured 3 cups of coffee, and set them down before them. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. "This is all I ever wanted," I said. "And you laughed. You doubted. You tried to destroy me." No one answered. My father stared into his cup, his shoulders hunched. My mother's lips pressed together, trembling. Amy's fingers tightened around the handle of her coffee until her knuckles whitened. The cafe was silent, but it wasn't empty. Every table, every wall, every beam of wood seemed to hum with the truth. I had survived. More than that, I had triumphed. They had the farm, the inheritance, the blessings of everyone in town. And now they had nothing. I looked at them one last time. "This place is mine. It will never be yours. Not now. Not ever." For a long while, we sat in silence, the only sound the soft clink of cups on saucers, the quiet breathing of people who had lost everything. When they finally rose to leave, no words were spoken. My father's hand lingered on the doorframe, as though he wanted to say something, but nothing came. My mother lowered her eyes. Amy walked out last, her shoulders slumped, her steps heavy. The door closed behind them, and the cafe was mine again. I turned off the lamps, listening to the quiet hum of the night. My heart was steady, my hands calm. Revenge hadn't come with fire or fists or shouted words. It had come with silence, with patience, with the simple act of surviving when no one wanted me to. And as the last light flickered out, I whispered into the dark, "Every secret leaves a trace. And every betrayal has its price." They tried to bury me in whispers, in lies, in fear. But I had built something stronger than their scorn. When they returned, broken and empty, I gave them coffee and silence. That was my revenge. Not in flames, not in fury, but in the quiet triumph of outlasting them all. And as the door closed behind their hollow figures, I knew this cafe was my inheritance. One they could never take away.